Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 34 of Circle of Fellows. This is a monthly online live panel discussion with 4 IABC Fellows on a topic of interest certainly to all of us, but also to communicators in general. We know that because the IABC editorial committee has selected these as the editorial theme of the month. And this theme is preparing yourself to join the C-suite, to become an executive in your organization, and 4 IABC Fellows here to talk about that. Joining me left to right as I see each of you on the thumbnail here on the Google Hangout. Angela, you're first. So who are you, Angela? What do you do? Angela, did we lose you? Oh man, all of this was working before I actually started it. All right. That's not the best way to start, but I'll send Angela a note while Barbara, who's not able to join us via camera, but I know you're there. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Shel. I'm so sorry about the camera because I got all dressed up for you guys and fixed my hair and everything, just like Jim. Anyway, I'm a 45-year business communicator who's trying desperately to retire. When I started in 1973, I was a journalist, and then later went right into corporate life about a year later, and climbed the corporate ladder for a while, for 25 years, and got into an international corporation where I was the highest ranking communicator. That was not in the C-suite. However, most of the time I had to work for everybody in the C-suite. I've since consulted for 20 years and taught for 13, and again have had a lot of exposure to people in the C-suite. So I'll be interested to hear this discussion unfold among my colleagues.
Great. Jim, you're next.
Jim Lukaszewski, glad you're all here today. I basically am a person who's been looking for trouble most of my life. I'm in the crisis business, and generally speaking, you don't get to know me unless you've done something, I don't know, stupid, silly, embarrassing, humiliating, whatever. It's just a very interesting practice. And I know lots of people, because once they start down this road, they tend to come back, periodically throughout their careers and throughout mine. It's kind of interesting. Basically, I sort of view myself as, this is sort of an offshoot of something Fred Garcia says. He decides himself as a management anthropologist, which I really think is cool. My job is really more like a management pathologist. I'm interested in and learn about why these really smart people do such stupid stuff. I actually have a new book coming out about it in about a year from now. But it's always been an interesting part of my life to deal with these very senior people. Only at times when they're essentially facing what I call career-defining moments. So my practice is pretty interesting.
Terrific. Mary Ann, you're next.
Good morning, all. Like Barbara, I worked with the C-suite folks on a daily basis, but most of the time I was at least one floor away, sometimes several, logistically. I'm also a consultant and been consulting for about 30 plus years, but I also wear a second hat. I now am the C-suite. I'm the executive director of the Washoe County Medical Society, which serves the physicians and physician assistants in the Reno, Sparks, Tahoe area of Nevada. So I've watched things change and grow. One of the things I have found by being in this slot these days, which is only about 18 months, is that my communication career has been absolutely essential. I couldn't do this job if I weren't a communicator. So that's a pretty interesting perspective to take.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it looks like Jim has stepped away for a minute and Angela has not been able to get back online. So Barbara and Mary Ann, it's you and me for a couple of minutes. I do want to let everyone who is watching live know that if you have a question for whatever configuration of the panel happens to be here at the moment, you can share that question with us on Twitter using the hashtag COF34. That is for Circle of Fellows 34, episode 34. COF34, I'm monitoring the questions and observations that are, I'm sure, going to flood in, and we'll share them with the panel. But while we're waiting for those questions, I want to make an observation. There are a lot of leaders in the corporate world who got their start in the rank and file. McDonald's has several executives who got started flipping hamburgers in local stores. Harley Davidson's president and CEO started out as a freight elevator operator at the company. Xerox's last CEO started as a field sales rep, and her successor was a mechanical engineering intern. IBM's Sam Palmisano was a salesman and an executive assistant. Not to sound like the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, but what do they got that others don't got?
Most of the CEOs that I worked with, or presidents or chairman of the board, they came through the ranks, and I think that helped them relate better to the employees who they were always addressing. I remember the communication thing that Mary Ann brought up, I think, is very important. Obviously, we're communication people, we're a little biased, but I remember going on the company plane once, sitting next to a senior executive who was really angry that I had talked our president into giving speeches on the shop floor. And we'd gotten to know each other pretty well. I could be candid with him, and I think that kind of candor is important, even if you're a lower level than the person you're working for. I said to him, why are you so upset about it? Why do you think he shouldn't be there? He goes, well, he could be embarrassed. He won't know the answers. I said, but he came up through the ranks in this business, and if the top guy doesn't know the answers, who's going to know the answers? I mean, one of the answers can always be, gee, I don't know the answer to that. I'll get right back to you. But this man was adamant, and he was a senior guy, and he retired soon after that. I think it was maybe a generational thing for him in manufacturing, where you gave more orders than work on building your team. So I just thought it was an interesting view, and I think the guys that came up through the ranks were much more in tune to be able to communicate and rally the team, because they'd been in their shoes.
Yeah, and I think rallying the team, motivating, inspiring, getting them all marching toward achieving the same goals is definitely a characteristic of leaders. And there is, I think, an important distinction between leadership and management, Jim. You must be aware of, the big conversation that's been going on for years, drawing the line between leading and managing.
He's on, I think. Well, I'll jump in until we get Jim back in the audio, because I was thinking about this, that the big difference I see is leaders have the ability and the stamina to get out of the way. A manager gets more closely involved in what's happening, where the leader gets out of the way and lets people do what they need to do and what they know how to do. Coaches, that leader coaches instead of directs. Those are kind of the main distinctions I see between managing and leading.
Yeah, Jim, can you hear us?
I'm going to say the traditional definition is that the manager is the person whose job it is to get the plan done, kind of the person who works inside the box, and the leader's job is quite different. His or her job is to go over the horizon, find new places to go and things to achieve, and come back and say, now that I've chosen where to go, let's figure out how to get there, which is where the strategy part comes in. It's kind of interesting, the inside the box, outside the box definition of these two functions.
And Angela is telling me that she lost her internet connection, and when it came back, she's being told she's not allowed to join the Hangout. So let me pose the next question, and then I'll see if I can multitask and help Angela get back into the panel.
Multitasking, a good trait for a top leader.
or not possible. It's changing your focus really fast, which is not necessarily a good thing. But no matter how good you are at what you do, when it comes to leadership, and especially leadership up at the highest levels of the organization, you don't have all the skills that you need. How many communicators can talk about supply chain management? How many of us have the skills to, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, managing or mentoring or motivating a staff, especially a staff that is not a group of communicators? How well do we understand the price earnings ratio, and could we answer investment analyst questions during a quarterly earnings call? Do you need to get an MBA or participate in executive training programs in order to move into the C-suite, or are there other routes?
Well, I don't have an MBA, but when I worked for a bank in St. Louis, I got a lot of really excellent in-service training because they did that at First Union Bank Corporation. And I also was working for a boss, part of the C-suite. He was a senior VP of marketing, who let me go to those things. So when I did investor relations, I got to go to a NARI conference and learn how to read a balance sheet and understand the PE ratios and that kind of thing, so that I was able to avail myself of a quasi MBA through a lot of different channels through continuing education. But I think one of the things you need to be a leader is to have the confidence to know what you don't know and to find those people who, again, can coach you, because you're never going to have the answer to everything. But if a leader can't read a balance sheet, then that's a problem. That definitely is a problem. So I think there's some basic skills that leaders need to have in order to function well, but you can't be everything to everybody, and you have to recognize that.
I think, I over the years have kind of developed because like so many senior people, we tend to work alone, so we tend to learn alone, and I think that's part of something that people junior to us kind of have to learn. How do you do that? I mean, how do you gain the experience you need? Universities are giving out degrees in crisis management these days to 22-year-olds. And the first question is, well, how do I get experience to be hired in that area? So I've written about this a bit. There's lots of experiences available. You can join the Army, that's one way, so to speak. But the issue is learning for us is really a personal kind of experience. So years ago, I actually had a CEO who would only see me on Wednesday afternoon around 4:30, something like that, and really nice guy and interesting work and interesting problems. And so, but I finally said, I'm at your disposal. Wednesday 4:30 works for me if it works for you. But why is this an important time? He said, well, every Wednesday I do a self-assessment of how I've helped people in the past week and what I've learned about the people I work with. Pretty savvy guy. I sort of translated that from his management approach to my own way that I learn. I teach this to others. Just 5 questions I ask every day. What's the most important thing I've learned today? What do I know now that I didn't know at 9 o'clock this morning? What questions have arisen that I need to deal with or that someone else needs to deal with? Ask yourself this pattern of questions every day. And people, if you work for me, you actually have a log. You keep a log, and you're required to answer one of these questions every day. And the log actually sits in my office, and it helps me understand what they're doing, what they're thinking, what they're learning. And I don't care. They don't have to write anything. They can write a word, something that reminds them of what the experience is in terms of value to them. But it's this systematic approach to learning, teaching yourself, that is really important. And that coupled with essentially studying leadership. I'm amazed at how many of our colleagues walk into a setting to be advisors, and they actually have no idea what the people they're advising do every day. So requisite one to me always is study leaders. pick people you like, people you know, or people you're interested in, and get in the habit of studying who these people are, what they do, how they think, the mistakes they make, the victories they have. So you get a sense of the patterns of behavior for these people. It helps enormously, and it also helps you have good conversations, which you can't have if all you got is communication advice.
I love what Jim said, but I want to also go back to something that Mary Ann said about her time in the bank. Made me think of this, because I also had time in a bank and an insurance company and a phone company before I was into international manufacturing. So this idea, we don't really know the demographic of who's listening right now, but if you're a younger communicator and you're trying to build your skills, what Mary Ann brought up was really important. So if you're in banking, you might go to the American Institute of Banking classes or webinars or seminars that they have, and chances are if you work for the bank, they're going to support that. Same with the insurance company. Or then I was in a phone company. They had their own kinds of training and places to go. And today, that kind of experience is so easy with the web, and to be able to join groups of others who are asking the same questions or trying to learn about the same subjects or find the same answers. So if you're younger and you're trying to build a lot of different experiences, look first to those specialized organizations and groups within the industry you're working in at the moment, or the nonprofit you're working at the moment, or the small business, because it's so much wider, the opportunity with the web today, so much easier to get to, so much cheaper than having budgets for conferences, that there should be no excuse. You should easily be able to make Jim's checklist for yourself later on if you've availed yourself of some of these opportunities.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who have taken these classes, gotten MBAs, gotten specialized training, who still don't make it into the C-suite. So clearly there are other criteria, other characteristics that propel you from below that to the rarefied air in the C-suite. I read the articles in Communication World, because this was the editorial theme of the month. Cassandra Frangos had a list of capabilities, according to the article, that you should be looking for. And one of them was temperament, which I found interesting, because I have known plenty of people in C-suites who had terrible temperaments. I've known people in C-suites, I wondered how they got there at all, but I think it was more to do with the organization than just the nature of C-suites in general. But what do you have to consider about your own temperament when your goal is to? And I know, Jim, that you're not wild about this phrase, and I share that with you. But if you want that seat at the executive table,
I think a couple things come to mind immediately. I mean, we sometimes have this sort of naive notion that we are problem solvers, and that just give us a minute and we'll have a solution for you. What I've learned over the years, I think, is that very few of us are capable of being problem solvers, because we have such a limited view of the organization. The only person who has a good view of the organization is the person at the top. But the one thing we can do, is offer suggestions. I call them options. And I actually teach a method of giving advice that involves the presentation of 3 options intentionally for every decision that has to be made. The 3 options are very easy. Doing nothing, because that's always out there. I like to talk about it first, because we know the cost of doing option. Other people just think it's doing nothing. The second is doing something, which I call the 100% option. And the third option is doing something more, the 125% option. And the reason I came upon this was because essentially we tend to have a tendency in our profession to believe we're giving a solution, and that we're so smart that if you don't do this, you're going to fail. And the problem with that is that there are other people in the room giving advice almost always, and what they do is they think they're better communicators than you are. I've never had a boss, maybe you have, who thought he was a bad communicator. They all think they're great. So it's you lose the ball game if the only thing you've got is communication and the only thing you've got is one solution. So I've learned that if you can give at least 3 options, and sometimes they're relatively small, just pick up the phone and call the guy. Why are we arguing about this? Have you called? Have you talked? And work it up. The simplest questions often have the most profound impact. But the point is, you get in the game. I think too often we're teaching people and use leadership with staff people. We tend to say you can win at this. But what I've learned is the goal for being in the C-suite is not to win in the C-suite, but to be there when the big decisions are made and find out how this gets done and learn from the process and be less worried about they're taking our advice specifically, but learning about all these other advice options that are out there that will inform you and make you the kind of person who is more valuable.
I think to address the issue of temperament, the leaders that I've worked with that I see as great leaders, even some of the board members I work with now, is they are patient, calm people. They have the ability to sit back and listen and not want to jump in with an answer or jump in with an opinion about somebody's solution. They're there. And they bring a calmness to the environment that allows other people to think freely and speak freely. So I think that's a really essential, like said, Shel. Yes, I've had some bosses in the past who were screamers. Not only they were just really screamers. They were awful to work with, and you wonder how they got there. And sometimes you think they got there because everybody else took a step backward.
Well, they're still taught in management school that the best ideas come from the conflict of intellects, from the struggle for dominance of an idea, and that if you have really calm discussions, you're not accomplishing anything. This is pervasive, and the problem I think for us is that, and I always ask this in the audiences I talk to, how many of you like war? Raise your hand. And how many of you like peace? Well, in groups of 50 or more, there's always one person who raises his hand for war because there's always one. But everybody else raises their hand for peace. And so, the fundamental question Shel is asking is, are you equipped to make the changes in the way you operate to accommodate what the boss is expecting? They're expecting they're expecting candor. They're expecting not so much solutions, but relevant things to their perspective. You have to know something about what they do every day to say things that matter to them, so to speak. And are you willing to live in this environment where it's kind of verbal and intellectual fisticuffs half the time? If you can't do that, then there's lots of other PR to do in this world. It doesn't have to be crisis work. Doesn't have to be in the C-suite. But you really have to change the way you think about yourself and about what these people are doing every day. My fundamental philosophy is very brief, but every problem that affects a leader or manager is a management problem before it is any other kind of problem, including communication. So if all you have is a communication solution for whatever comes up, that's why they don't call you, because they all think they're terrific communicators. So why call you? Like other people, they're not listening to us as an advisor. They're listening to us for combat. They're looking at the way they would do it if they were communicating versus how we're telling them to communicate. I always like to be able to talk about a little broader issues and ask some decent questions in the beginning, so we have a conversation that gets to what the solution is from their perspective as opposed to from my perspective. It's a different way to think. It's very hard, but it's very powerful.
I think you can have a good, solid conversation without conflict, Jim. I'm not talking about people sitting back and doing the Minnesota nice thing where nobody's candid and nobody says what they really think. I'm talking about an environment that is such that people can be candid. You can have conflict without the fisticuffs that you talk about.
I agree with that. I'm actually a peaceful person. My job is to make peace, and I think that's what our role is to a great degree. But you can't start there, because that's not where the person sitting across the desk is they're hiring lawyers and doing the stuff they do to advance their perspective, and in most cases to win something. And I think for us, winning, as I said earlier, is really an irrelevancy. The issue is making progress incrementally, because that's how these things get solved. The only thing that happens instantaneously is crisis and bad news. Otherwise, it's working through systematically how we get these situations resolved.
One of the other capabilities that was listed in this article from Cassandra Frangos was change management and reinvention. And, you know, when I first saw that heading, I thought, well, man, communicators, we do change management all the time, but we don't craft the change, right? The leadership crafts the change and tells us to communicate it and help enact it. Are communicators positioned well to analyze the situation in the company and determine the best route to take and what kind of change needs to be made, and then turn to the specialists in the organization to activate that? Or is that another skill that we need to acquire?
My list was, you mentioned kind of earlier, I call them talents, and you mentioned them: initiative, inspiration, that's intuition, loyalty, urgency. But my most important, I think, item on this list of what the skills you need are inconsistency. And every time somebody, I said this in an article, the editor always changes it to consistency. Well, you know, consistency is boring. Consistency is somebody else's standard, but inconsistency is inspirational. Inconsistency makes you more interesting. Inconsistency is the issue that helps you manage your part of the discussion, and instead of defending yourself from a communications perspective. There is a different way of thinking when you're in that suite, looking for ideas to move the process of the ball forward, and that's one of them. Not just mouthing the usual things we talk about, but actually thinking about unusual, interesting, different, and inconsistent ways. When you think about how things got discovered, major things, they weren't discovered from consistency. They were discovered from accidents. They were discovered from mistakes. They were discovered from, you know, boo-boos, so to speak. That's part of what the inconsistency thought process is about.
In that same article that you're talking about, Shel, they talk about you have to be willing to unlearn things you've already learned. And that's interesting, especially with again, I bring up technology, with the speed of technology, and how a very savvy leader today might not have grown up in such a fast technological environment, and may have a little more difficulty grasping the changes coming as fast as maybe a younger demographic in his or her organization. So I thought that was an interesting point made in that article, that you really have to be willing to unlearn something and try something else. I'll give you a funny little human interest story. I found this hard to believe it happened, but then I heard a similar story right afterwards. I have a relative who's in college, and he picked up his grandma's phone, which still had a dial on it, and he said, "What do I do with this?" And grandma, on the other hand, has just recently picked up a computer and figured out what she could do with sending messages through Facebook. So I think you're going to be facing this vast demographic difference at these times than maybe a generation ago. And so it will be difficult, but you have to be willing to learn new things and unlearn some things pretty quickly and at a much faster pace than before.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the other thing we need to think about is not everybody is designed to be a leader. You know, that was quite a debate when we did a leadership program through IABC Minnesota some years ago. And in part of the assessment, there's a discussion about, is leadership a skill you can learn, or is it an acquired talent? You either have the talent to be a leader or you don't. And that it's okay if you don't have the talent to be a leader, because not everybody can be leaders anyway. There's not enough room not enough room at that table to have everybody leading. So I think that's kind of an interesting perspective, is to be good enough at assessment, your self-assessment, to say, this is where I belong and where I'm most comfortable, or these are untapped talents that I have and that I should nurture them and pursue them, and yes, unlearn and learn new things, so that you can be more than just the order taker at the table, because not everything is a crisis. There's a lot of day-to-day things that need to go on that sometimes you need to offer the best advice you can, and it's not always inside the communication circle. I've done that many times, where the advice that I'm giving somebody is not about communicating. It's about some other segment of the business, another approach, another strategy, another thought.
Well, I'm giving up on getting Angela back. She's tried a tablet, a different computer, and she's just getting the message saying that she can't get into the Hangout. I think it's because she was here once, and I don't know. But we'll look forward to Angela the next time she's on one of these panels. Two of the other characteristics that Cassandra listed in her article were resilience and a strategic approach. And, you know, the strategic approach I find particularly important. I think a lot of communicators get into the business because we're good at the craft of communicating. We're good writers. We're good designers. We're good with social media. You know, one of the big problems I have with a lot of the people who come into the organization in the social media position is that they may have built up a personal follower list of 50,000 people on Twitter. It doesn't mean that they know how to use Twitter to advance the objectives of the organization. I think, you know, strategy, if you're trying to get into the C-suite, you really need to have a big picture of the entire organization and see not just how communication impacts that, but how all of the various pieces work together. It's a good understanding of business in general.
Yes.
I agree. And
jump in, Barbara.
I was going to say that the second piece of the strategic ideas was execution. And I think where, even if you're not in the C-suite yourself, I know a lot of communicators who intelligently added kind of a human relations understanding to their job. They either worked for human resources, or they had some assignments, like it could be a shutdown or a merger. They had some assignments that really helped them appreciate what the people in the organization were thinking. So I think in executing the strategic ideas, that C-suite person still has to rely on his or her own communication skills, or a very good professional staff to help work that through with the people. Again, I mentioned the wide demographic before. You have to be able to execute what you think is your great idea. And the only way that's going to happen is through your people, whether they're your employees, your customers, your vendors, your donors, whoever they are. You've got to work them through people. And many times in my career, I found the people element, really understanding what makes people tick, understanding your demographics, understanding how within those demographics they might tick in a different way. I found that lacking a lot. And when it was apparent, for the things I mentioned, like mergers or shutdowns or things like that, the plan went a lot smoother.
There was another article in Communication World under this theme, and it was ways that you can sabotage yourself to keep yourself out of the C-suite. Some people may want to do that, but one of them is, in fact, it was the first one listed, was not speaking up. When I started my job here, it was after 21 years as an independent consultant, where I had a client. The client was usually the chief communication officer or the vice president of internal communications or what have you. And I was incredibly circumspect when I was with their bosses, because I didn't want to, steal their thunder or step on their toes or say anything that might come back to them. And I brought that behavior with me here. And I have been told that I need to speak up. It was just 21 years of habit. It is important to, not just sit there and nod your head and go along with things, right? You need to speak your mind.
I learned something kind of interesting from John Graham, who's was at the time an executive vice president with Fleischman Hillard in St. Louis, back when I was at the bank, because I'd never worked with a PR firm before. The other organizations I'd worked with didn't have outside counsel. And we're in a meeting one day with the CEO. I think we were talking about the annual report. And John said, Mary Ann and I agree that we should do blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there trying to have a poker face because John and I hadn't talked about this. And so when we're over and the meeting's done and we're out in the hall, out of earshot of, I said, we didn't talk about it. He said, no, but he said, we would have if we'd had time. And on more than one occasion, he would raise something where he would say, I agree with Mary Ann that we should do X. And I learned that was his way of supporting me in kind of an unusual way that didn't make me as the internal person sound like I was an idiot or that I wasn't smart enough to think of those things. And his answer every time would be, well, you'd have thought of that if you'd had time. And so I used kind of a similar sort of technique with clients in management, is to kind of bring the person that I'm working with and representing on that inside. And it's tough to speak up. I think that's the hardest thing that we do. Particularly, I think those of us, Barbara was talking about unlearning thing, those of us who came out of a really true traditional journalism model, like I learned at the University of Missouri, we were trained to be observers and not to have opinions unless we were writing an opinion piece, and then it was clearly labeled. So that to unlearn and be able to speak up appropriately, candidly, without being rude, be diplomatic, is a hard thing to unlearn.
I think that one of the things our profession is guilty of is too many suggestions. We feel obligated that whenever somebody asks a question or does something, we somehow have to speak up and say something. So I when I'm working with staff, I say, look, here's the way to think about advice. You have to first of all ask, does it really matter? In other words, is it going to help the boss achieve his or her objectives? Is it going to, this is all before you speak. Is it going to help the organization achieve its objectives? If the answer to those two questions is yes, is it still really necessary to suggest? There's the usual, the save money, make money, that sort of thing. But the killer question before giving advice is, what will fail? What will not succeed? What will essentially not happen if you don't make this suggestion? It's a negative approach, but to me, we advise too much. We don't really recognize that, we have 5 ideas right on the spot, but the person you're talking to hasn't got last week's work done yet. And now he's got 5 things he's probably going to have to refuse to do to be courteous to you. And they weren't that important. We tend to be really communication and action driven when we really have to think about, does it matter? Is it important? Does it help people get things done? But most of all, is it really gonna have a significant difference? And I believe, Shel, that you can train yourself to think this way and to control yourself to think that way.
Yeah, interestingly, Jackie Sargent is watching live, and she said, I love your comments on strategy. I keep saying I can't develop a communications plan without knowing the business plan. It's not a separate function. And that's the kind of speaking up that I think can bring you to the attention of the leadership in the organization, that you're not out there just crafting a bunch of communications based on whatever potential feature story comes over the transom. You're there to serve the strategy of the organization and advance the goals of the organization. If you can demonstrate that, you'll be on their radar.
Yeah, and the last corporate job I had, that was extremely important, to tie every single communications effort into the business plan. I don't recall that I was pushed to do that earlier in my career. I was more in segmented environments where, you know, maybe the feature story was more important that time, or the video, or the program, or introducing some new policy or something along that way. But my corporate career later on, 13 years, you better have it tied to the goals of the business, or it wasn't getting funded and you weren't doing it.
Yeah.
I think another dimension of leadership that I don't think it gets talked about enough is building trust. You know, if you get the reputation as somebody that is going to do what you say you will do, and that you have that level of integrity that they can count on you, that you have built that bank of trust.
I think along that line, one of the things that I find very powerful, and with some objection often from staff people inside, is if I know of a resource that could help this executive or this group of people, even if they're, you know, a competitor or even in a related field. I learned this just, you know, we were talking to a guy who was having serious problems, and he was a real fan of the book Good to Great, which I liked the book. Yeah. And so I said, you know, you really liked it. Have you ever talked to the author? And he said, could I talk to the author? I said, he's a really nice guy. I bet if you called him up, you know, and invite him to lunch, he would come, or you could go to him. Would he answer the phone? And it's like, he's an author. He's sitting there waiting for the phone to ring, for crying out loud. So a funny thing, I mean, his top person, I'm having a senior moment. I don't remember the name of the author.
Jim Collins.
Thank you. And they made one phone call and they had lunch. And it's so interesting because this is, in a way, this is not even near the box kind of thinking, but it's really, really helpful for people to have access to other voices. So often when situations are serious, staff people tend to link arms around the top person and keep people away from them. But what you find is they're always looking for more information, more input, more questions to answer. And one of the most trust-building relationships that you have is when you can bring in resources, even though they may be similar to what you do, but they have a perspective that your boss could learn from. This is a memorable event for them about you. It's one of the things that will make them call you earlier because you have an idea that's different than everybody else.
And I think trust. I read The Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey, the younger, not the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This is his son who wrote The Speed of Trust. But he identified these 13 characteristics of trust, and he uses the model of a tree. At the root of the tree is your character. Character matters, and then it's competence. And then there are 3 characteristics that are sort of a combination of character and competence. And I think if you can pay attention to those and engage in the behaviors that demonstrate that you have the character that people can trust, that you have the capabilities and the competence that people can trust, then they'll rely on you more and more. And your likelihood of being considered for the C-suite increase.
Did you see his model was a tree, T-R-E-E?
Yes, T-R-E-E. The root of the tree is the character, and the trunk of the tree is competence, and then up where the branches are is the combination of the two.
Have you heard of the metaphor of the monkey tree?
That I haven't.
The monkey tree is, we're into employee engagement, and we want them to do things, and we're having great trouble with this because employees think engagement means one thing, and the bosses think it's getting the most out of you in the same 8 hours that you put in every day. And so, I remind bosses to think about essentially the view of employees. The only person that has a decent view of the environment of an organization is the guy at the top of the tree. But if everybody else is a monkey on the side of the tree and they look up, the boss sees a lot of smiling faces, but what do the people on the tree see on the way up? Okay.
Right.
Not exactly conducive to engagement, it seems to me. So the entry analogy is interesting.
It's like being the last dog in the pack, right?
Mm-hmm. Wagging tails.
Yes. Is that what you see? I was talking to a friend of mine who actually has a master's degree in leadership, and we were talking about the definition of leadership, and he threw in a word that I thought was interesting. He said it's intentional. Most of us are hardwired to want to be part of the pack. We want to belong. We don't want to be out in front of the pack. So one of the characteristics, I think, of somebody who is aiming for that position at the top of the organization is making the decision that, being a leader is something that they're not born, regardless of, the fact that that is an old cliche. You have to determine to be a leader and figure out how you're going to do that. Listening, I think, is another characteristic that we probably ought to talk about, because and I'm certainly guilty of this. As soon as somebody starts telling me what their issue is, that they're looking to me to help communicate about this issue, I'm already framing my answer. I'm already coming up with solutions. I'm not sitting patiently back waiting for them to finish. And that I think works to my detriment. Listening means shutting up and listening.
Hardest thing we do.
We do what?
It's the hardest thing we do.
Oh, hardest thing we do, yeah.
Keep our mouth shut and learn from what's going on. And bosses have the same problem. There's an exercise that I've seen people use, and I try to use it myself. It's called SOLER, S-O-L-E-R, and it just talks about your position with relationship to the person who's speaking. And S stands for sitting, standing erectly. O is openness, with don't your arms aren't folded, you aren't looking away, that sort of thing. It also stands for open-ended questions: who, what, why, where, when, how. And the exercise is that you have people partner with the person next to them, and your partner, if you're the one talking, that your partner is forbidden to respond to you. The only thing they can't do is leave the room. So, and it's about a 1-minute exercise. And by the time 1 minute is over, you could strangle these people because they're not listening to you, right? They're turning around, they're looking at the newspaper, something like that. And then, but the second part of the exercise, and you both do it, so you both get the feeling of someone intentionally not listening to you. And then the other part of the exercise is using open-ended questions. It's impossible not to respond when the question is, why is this important to you? Who are you trying to impress? What's this all about? There's really a tremendous interesting circumstance, and puts the burden on you and I, the listener, if we're going to talk, to ask questions that are meaningful to the person who's got the problem. Interesting approach. It's on the web. Just look up SOLER and it's described there. I forget who admitted it, but
I think some of this has to do with maturity, and I don't mean age, I mean maturity, and realizing what good answers you can get if you listen. I'm a big fan of cooking shows, so I was watching one the other day, and they were on a team exercise, and they're making fried chicken, and a woman says to the guy next to her, "You're putting way too much batter on that chicken. It's not going to work because," when she said because, he said, "This isn't my first chicken rodeo." And he didn't listen, and guess what? They lost. He had too much batter on his chicken. So I think when you mature and realize it's not, and don't break in and listen to that because. What comes after because? Because somebody else may have a better idea than you. Or a better answer.
Yeah, it's back to that, having the patience to not jump in and fix the problem. It's having the patience to listen to somebody else's idea with an open mind and say, well, that's not how I would do this, but I think that'll work. So at least so that you can have some kind of a dialogue in the future about the solution.
The article talked about self-sabotaging behaviors. That was written, by the way, and I'm absolutely positive I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of her name, Theomarie Karamanis. Did I get that right? Does anybody know her?
Yeah, I think you're close. Yes, I know.
I hope I'm close. She had a couple of bullets in here that I think are the kinds of behaviors that lead people to just not take you seriously, but that you're also not conscious of. One of these is weak language. She has some examples here saying, "This is a great idea, right?" Or just only hopefully, I guess, or I have only been on the job for 2 months rather than I have been on the job for 2 months. And then she talks about things like uptalk. Uptalk is where you end a sentence with a question kind of sound. Vocal fillers is what she calls these. I was just listening to a podcast I love that deals with language, and John McWhorter, the linguist who hosts that, calls them softeners, and that's words like, right? I'm going to be like 10 minutes late. And yeah, I remember talking to my daughter when she was a teenager saying, you got to stop talking like that if you want people to take you seriously. But certainly you don't hear people in the C-suite talking like that. And I absolutely agree. I think if you talk like that, they are going to take you less seriously.
Yeah, that was one thing that drove me nuts living in Minnesota 31 years, is so many people in a room, and not any of the leaders, but a group, a task force, and they'd say, I may be wrong, or I don't know if this is right. And it's like, just say what you think. And when I would say what I thought, was told I was abrupt because I didn't qualify what I thought.
But look at you now, you're in the CEO suite.
That's right.
Seat, excuse me.
This is sort of related, but we're all senior people, so we get this question, I think, fairly frequently. I got a boss, I like him, I think he's honorable, blah, 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 blah. You know, there are things he should be doing that I just cannot convince him to do. Okay, so you're older, smarter, whatever. How do you get people to do things that they clearly don't want to do? And I sort of developed what I call the 10-day rule for ideas. The people we work with are generally adults. They make up minds intentionally. And when they don't respond to things we suggest, they're doing it, and they know they're doing it. So my rule kind of is, well, not kind of, it is, if they don't cotton to what I'm suggesting in 10 days, I drop it and go on to something else. I mean, what is the one thing we do best of any staff function? It is ideas. We throw ideas away every single day. So think of something else. You know, some of the people I talk to say they've been ragging on this person for like 6 months, maybe a year. Well, hey, he's not going to do it. So give it 10 days, blah, blah. The exception to this rule is this. If it's illegal, immoral, unnecessary, inappropriate, or monumentally stupid, then you really want to find another place to work, you know, because people who do this are adults, and they're doing this intentionally. The one thing you learn in doing crisis work and in watching people make mistakes, and especially doing things that are unethical and inappropriate, these are adults, and they intentionally make these decisions, and just to see if they can even get it done, and they're amazed that they do. So I sort of tell people this 10-day rule really actually helps them relax a bit and say, well, I can think of something else for them to do. But we own something so vividly that we can't let go of them. And a lot of us hang around with people we like because we think we can change them from their behaviors. That never works. It just never works. And you spend your 10 years in your career trying to change people, and you know they're adults and they're going to do what they do regardless of what you suggest. So suggest something different.
That's interesting.
One more from the list of self-sabotaging behaviors is letting other people take credit for your work. And I found that one interesting because I have been told more than once earlier in my career that a great way to get your boss on your side is to let your boss take credit for your work.
Huh.
I don't know if that's anything that you've...
I never care about it myself. As long as something productive occurs, I don't care who gets the credit for it. It just doesn't matter to me. Maybe it's just my state of life, but I'm more interested in seeing this incremental progress occur rather than keeping the score.
I agree with you, Jim. In a practical way, though, I remember over the years in IABC, when you would win an award, I was always careful to put a team on the award or add the company name or add something with my name. I never took my personal credit away. Never gave that away, but tried to include somebody. And sometimes that got me some mileage, because then the other people you had included talked about how really good, when they thought back on what the program was or the initiative, they thought really well about it because they got the award too. So they talked in more positive terms about the kinds of positive work a communicator could bring to the table. So in that way, it's kind of petty, but
I think there's a difference between letting somebody take credit for your work and making somebody look good.
You know, one of the when you have become a truly trusted strategic advisor, people are going to say things you say. You know, one of the things is they'll quote you when you're not there, or they'll quote you when you're in. You know, like Jim just said, blah blah blah. Right? They tell stories and give you credit for it. They tell stories and keep the credit themselves. That sort of thing. You know, it seems to me that the issue is, does the boss know or not? And in my experience, they're paying attention, because one of their jobs is to evaluate and estimate the value of the people around them all the time. And if you come in from the outside, one of the questions as a senior person you get asked by the person you're hired by is, say, you know, how does Shel rank against people doing his job in other companies that you've seen? And if you it's not something I pay attention to. This is the second most important thing bosses do, is evaluate people. They know, they just know, and so I don't worry about it.
Yeah.
No.
Well, that's good bosses. The boss who always takes credit is not a good boss.
Right.
He's not paying attention. There's a difference, you know. A good leader, a good manager will share the credit. Even if you're making that individual look good, that person will acknowledge that you made him or her look good.
We're down to just a couple of minutes. So what I'd like to do is ask each of you to share your one top tip for positioning yourself to eventually get up into the C-suite. And then I'll let everybody know about next month's Circle of Fellows. So Barbara, how about you start this off?
Well, I think I would say that if you're moving up the organizational ladder, it's really less important about your specialty or your functional knowledge, but more about leadership. And I want to emphasize truly appreciating the demographics of your organization, because some are so large and so expansive these days. There's nothing I ever found more rewarding than to have the CEO come to my office and lean on the door jamb and ask me what I thought about something.
Yeah. Jim?
A couple of things. You mentioned here being candid. It's one of the things that people ask for all the time. Can I trust this person? And I'll tell you, of all the staff functions, the one that has a reputation for holding things back is communication, interestingly enough. Candor is important. I think secondly is having a management perspective. It's not so much even knowing the organization as it is knowing how these people think, lead, make decisions, so that you can play a reasonable and helpful part of that. And third is the notion to remember that it's their bus. It's their bus. You are on it at their convenience. Help them do their jobs better. If you don't like the bus, get off. Start one of your own. You get lots of options in PR. But if C-suite is your target, focus on getting there in these sensible ways.
Yeah, there's more Jim Collins for you, right? Being on or off the bus.
Yeah.
Marianne?
Oh, thank you. Well, to kind of build on what Barbara and Jim has said, I think you have to have the confidence and make the assumption that you have a role to play in that C-suite. It's back to not holding back. It's back to listening well and having that bigger picture, so that when you're there, you're not there with the idea that you have to provide a solution. You're there to be part of the solution.
Wonderful. And as we hit the top of the hour, I just want to let everybody know next month, Circle of Fellows, episode 35, is set for noon Eastern time on Thursday, July 19th. The topic is how to build a customer experience strategy. So a complete departure from this month's topic. The panel is made up of Amanda Hamilton Atwell, who we were very happy to see at the World Conference earlier this month, George McGrath, Jim Schaefer, and one of our 2018 class of fellows, Todd Hattori, will be joining us on his first Circle of Fellows. So look forward to seeing everybody then. And Barbara, Jim, Marianne, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you, Shel.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.